after Gaza, standing again at Sinai. And the title plays on the famous book by Judith Plaskow, Standing Again at Sinai, which requires Jews to return to Sinai, the site of God's covenant with the Israelites when the Torah was given, and reread the tradition through feminist hermeneutical prism. After the Gaza genocide, Jews ought to stand again at Sinai and ascertain how to re-enter a covenant, a re-entry that will depend on righting wrongs. The re-entry after Gaza entails centering Palestinian ethical claims upon Jews. It is a reparative covenant with God and Palestinians, and God signifying the tradition, the Jewish histories, and it's a kind of a broader term. And this process will not happen without, the one will not happen without the other. Re-entry into the covenant, standing again at Sinai, will not happen without also repairing the wrongs. Returning to Sinai after Gaza amounts to a restorative justice praxis. In other words, this return, or tshuva in Hebrew, which also means atonement, would signify a decolonial move, which is of course not a metaphor, it's tangible, acknowledgement of harms dating back over a century, and accountability for past injustice through imagining future horizons that do not replicate injustice. Okay, so in her resignation letter from the Biden administration, the first such a public letter by a Jewish appointee, political appointee, which she released on Nakba Day in May 2024, Lily Greenberg Hall referred to Biden as, quote, making Jews the face of the American war machine, and that is so deeply wrong. Jewish safety cannot and will not come at the expense of Palestinian freedom, she continued. Making Jews the face of the American war machine makes us less safe, end of quote. In her reference to making Jews the face of the American war machine, Greenberg Hall names the persistence of imperial political, cultural, and economic forces in the dynamics that unfold on the ground in Palestine, Israel. To identify how weaponized anti-Semitism serves imperial designs is not to take away the agency of Jews in their colonization of Palestine and the racialized structures of dispossession and elimination they put in place, which is also, this is why I connect really strongly to the point made earlier, Violet's point made earlier. The giving of the Torah at Sinai occurred after the exodus from slavery and before the entry to the land. Since the Jewish holiday of Passover occurred amid the 6 months of Israeli genocidal assault in Gaza, many Jews in Palestine solidarity circles felt despair, not knowing how they could celebrate Jewish liberation at a time when the utter unfreedom and destruction of Palestinians occurred in their name. Palestinian unfreedom has long been justified for the protection of a political entity that claims to embody Jewish liberation and redemption. Therefore, a small group of American rabbis and Jewish Israeli activists orchestrated an action using the Jewish imperative to feed the hungry during the Passover Seder. Carrying bags of rice and flour and other food items, the delegation of rabbis and Jewish Israeli activists walked toward the gates of Gaza. They sang passages from the Seder, conveying the imperative of feeding the hungry. The military quickly stopped them, and 7 were arrested. Rabbi Brent Rosen, who is also my rabbi, FYI, who's one of the American rabbis detained, wrote about the absurdly tragic reason for his arrest in a piece that he published in The Nation. The Americans, he writes, were told bluntly that they were being held for attempting to bring food into Gaza. Critically, the famine generated by Israel amounts to a war crime done in the name of self-defense, and the rabbi's symbolic action, drawing upon the Jewish script of the Passover Seder, is about reclaiming Jewish meanings from the jaws of cruelty and violent ideology. This motif has permeated Jewish protests during the Gaza genocide, Passover, that period of time, the 1 week. It was all about reconnecting to Sinai and the Exodus story for its deeper meaning. And as public intellectual Naomi Klein reflected, it's about breaking free from the shackles of idolatry. In Seder in the Streets in New York City in April 24, after saying the traditional blessing over the bitter herbs, Naomi Klein meditated on Zionism as the golden calf Jews have been worshipping. She called Jews to undergo an exodus from this idolatrous captivity. In this meditation, Klein conveys the general sentiment of the movement of Jews critical of Zionism, which I've written a lot about and did a lot of kind of ethnographic work with. We cannot be free until Palestinians are free, young Jewish American activists chant. However, those Passover actions happened with urgency, in mourning, and through an effort to shatter the golden calf of Zionism, to re-access the Jewish tradition historically through direct accountability to Palestinians. Other Jews actively attacked humanitarian tracks and destroyed food en route to Gaza. These are Jews who long ago left Sinai. Landlord's theology. Those who deliberately and repeatedly attacked humanitarian convoys embody landlord theology, and also there is a lot of recent work on kind of this notion of the landlord, the Baal Bait. One example would be by Palestinian scholar Nadim Rouhana. These Jewish settlers who attacked the convoys are quote unquote, are in the quote unquote promised land, an illusionary redemption predicated on eternal violence and domination. To read the Bible as a land title reveals, as Israeli Jewish scholar Amnon Raz Krakotskine has argued, the colonization of Judaism by the Christian imagination about the Jews, whose quote unquote return to Zion, undergirded by a presumption that Jews were not really from Europe, has carried with it seeds of two genocides, the Shoah, the Holocaust, and Gaza, as the culmination of the Nakba that predated 1948. And to say that Zionism is the colonization of Jewish consciousness by Christian imagination about the Jews is not to take away the criminal agency of these actors. Activists in a new movement called the Faithful Left. It's a movement that came into being after the election cycle, the Israeli election cycle of 2022, which resulted in fascist settler coalition. It was a very clarifying moment. The Faithful Left emerged during that time. It rejects the theology of landlords, arguing that only God is sovereign, and demanding to reclaim the Jewish tradition from its violent desecration. They seek to re-access the more gentle Judaism of the diasporas, and with it virtue ethics that define norms for interpersonal and intercommunal relationships. Anti-occupation Jewish Israeli religious activist Michael Manekin, for example, wrote in a piece in Haaretz amid the Gaza genocide about his rejection of the ascendance of Judaism that sacralizes starvation, domination, and war. He expresses a disdain for example, Rabbi Dov Lior, very kind of popular, who sanctioned the looting and framing the looting of the humanitarian convoys, framing it as a sacred act, the looting, that could trump keeping the Shabbat, because they came to him because there was a question, can we do it on Shabbat? And he's like, yes. And Manikin writes, quote, for Lior, blocking aid to a starving population, even against the wishes of the Israeli military, presumably, and an extreme right-wing government, is a more crucial religious commandment than keeping the Shabbat, end of quote. Another rabbi, Eliyahu, who is the chief rabbi of Tzfat, even wrote a prayer for the looters and those who prevent humanitarian aid from reaching the victims and survivors in Gaza. This rabbinic sanctioning for Mannequin is deeply troubling. He further writes, quote, the very idea of violating the Shabbat to create more hunger and as a means of punishment or coercion is alien to Jewish rabbinic tradition and would undoubtedly have baffled our sages. However, in Israel, it is an increasingly mainstream position. To be a good Jew is to put the collective punishment of Palestinians ahead of basic observance, end of quote. Mannequin calls to reclaim Jewish ethical traditions in the face of this desecration of the tradition. So in the second annual conference of the Faithful Left, held in February 2024, so recently, religious Zionists who served during the genocidal assault in Gaza in the military met behind closed doors to discuss the contradictions they experienced between their actions and their understanding of Jewish ethics. They reject how the Jewish tradition became drafted in a discourse that posits, quote, the more violent you are and believe in the war, the more Jewishly authentic you are, and the more you speak of peace, the more you are assimilated into the West. That's my translation of some proceedings from that. This directly opposes the centering of the Amalek discourse and the downgrading of many other resources within the Jewish tradition as weak and diasporic, unlike a theology of landlords. The Faithful Left sees itself, therefore, as challenging from within the sources of and institutions of religious Zionism, the supremacist and violent interpretations of Jewish power. However, a gentler theology of landlords is still a theology of landlords. Its primary concern is for the Jewish tradition to be consistent with itself rather than, as restorative justice prescribes, center Palestinian ethical claims upon us. What this examination of the discourse within the Faithful Left reveals, in my analysis, is that theology after Gaza that seeks to make Jewish power nicer and more consistent with presumed Jewish values as operationalized within a quote-unquote Jewish home is not the same as standing again at Sinai and retelling the story from the perspective of its victims as a hermeneutical praxis of repair. The returning religious Zionist soldiers who felt inconsistently Jewish as they donned their uniforms and became instruments in a genocidal war involving Jewish narratives of revenge never shuttered the golden calf, the sacralization of Jewish safety and security, as Nadira Shalov-Kevorkian illuminates in her work. At the same time, that settlers attacked humanitarian convoys, other Jews in Palestine, Israel marched together with Palestinians from 48 to mark Nakba Day, and with an aspiration to co-create a civic space and a political horizons based on acknowledgement of the Nakba, redress of historical harms, and scripting together a common political ethics of equality. Not supremacist discourse, and Orly Noy has written about that particular understanding. She's an Iranian Jewish-Israeli public intellectual, really. Therefore, Jewish ethics after the Gaza genocide has to dismantle this golden calf, this idolatry, and its illusion of agency, redemption, and freedom. Both manifestations, the gentler one of the Faithful Left and the grotesque of the looting landlords, do not interrogate Zionism as a political theology whose focus on homemaking has meant uprooting and erasure. As Hagar Kotev, which is a Jewish philosopher, writes about how violence is constitutive of Jewish Israeli consciousness, and I would say not only Israeli, Zionist broadly. Therefore, even if mostly not conceptualizing their agency as theological or religious, anti-Zionist Jewish activists who center the Nakba as an ongoing structure that has now escalated into a genocide, in effect do theology when they don't do theology, when they deepen their learning about the Nakba as a form of unlearning Zionist mythology and subsequently imagine concretely Palestinian return, such as one example would be the organization Zochrot, or when they engage in binational translation movement of literature, seeking to reclaim Arabic or Persian as Jewish languages and cultures. They do a restorative political theology of unlearning supremacy and reclaiming how to be Jewish in the space outside a settler colonial and supremacist frame. A restorative political theology, therefore, is theological by unlearning supremacist Zionism or what Solo Baron called Zionist lachrymose history, a process that requires counter-archival learning, learning outside of Zionist historiography in order to retrain the political imagination, which is a reference to Hannah Arendt's work on the political imagination is a muscle that needs to be trained and retrained. This illuminates kind of, and I mentioned earlier, Ella Shochat, identifying together with Ella Shochat the intersecting geographies of Arab, Jewish, and Palestinian dislocation, as well as indigenous peoples' genocides associated with modernity coloniality. So unlearning Zionism, in other words, means excavating Judaism from the debris of Gaza and Zionist historiographical epistemic destruction. Back to Sinai, just a few minutes. Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, a Jewish American who's been in the Jewish-Palestine solidarity space since 1966, too, like Naomi Klein, spoke recently. In fact, she was responding to a talk I gave about my work, Days of Awe. And so she spoke about how, upon descending from the mountain, from Sinai, Moses, enraged by the idolatrous behavior of the Israelites, whose impatience in the wilderness, in the twilight between their liberation from oppression and the quote-unquote promised land, led them to worship an idol, shattered the tablets upon which the Ten Commandments were inscribed. Speaking while the genocide against Gaza is still ongoing, Rabbi Lin said the shards of the tablets represent the current reality of the Jewish tradition. Is it possible to put it back together? Rabbi Lin's image of reconstituting the tradition from the shattered tablets is striking to me because of its similarity with the Kabbalistic notion of Shvirat HaKelim, of the breaking of the vessels. Shvirat HaKelim, or Tzimtzum, contraction, refers to how to make room, in order to make room or space for creation itself, God or Ein Sof, the infinite, contracted in order to create that empty space into which God then sent light, which initiated the creation process. 7 of the 10 Sfirot, or the vessels, were shattered by the power of this light of creation. Their shards, entangled with divine sparks, descended into the abyss. This act of creation, entangled with the breaking of the vessels, denotes the utter disharmony of creation, making room for human agency to repair, or tikkun olam. In the Kabbalistic discourse, the brokenness of Jews interconnects, always had to interconnect with the brokenness of the world, of everyone's brokenness. However, over the centuries, tensions emerged between more particularistic and more kind of universal interpretations of tikkun olam. For Rabbi Lin, the repair of Judaism means its decolonization, or an exodus from slavery slavery within the false idol of Zionism. And this process will go hand in hand with decolonizing Palestine concretely, physically, land back. Jews need to grapple historically through a restorative untheology, rather than mythologically, with the blood-soaked debris in Gaza as utter profanity. The most urgent political question for Jews in Palestine and Israel, therefore, is also a theological one, even if they see themselves as atheists or not religious. How can I be Jewish in this space, but not a settler colonial supremacist? It requires us, me, to stand again at Sinai. Thank you very much.